Okay, thank you all and welcome to another one of our BA at Leeds on Zoom sessions. Our second speaker today is Dr. Elizabeth Biggs. She's based at the History Cluster at the University of the West of England, and her book St Stephen's College, Westminster, A Royal Chapel and English Kingship, 1348 to 1548, was published by Boyd Ellenborough earlier this year. She has a pandemic book. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
I was very pleased to see how quickly you'd had your book out this year. Her doctoral work focused on the canons of St Stephen's Chapel and the Palace of Westminster, and she's since worked on postdoc projects looking at St Stephen's Cloisters, as well as the transformation of Durham Priory into a secular college. Her paper today is entitled The Surviving Early 16th Century Chantry Chapels at St Stephen's, Westminster, Architecture, Patronage and Reuse. Over to you.
Thank you, Harriet, and thank you for organising this, and thank you everybody for coming to listen. I'll just share my screen, and there we go, and get started. So, deep within the current 19th century Houses of Parliament in London can be found a 16th century double-storey and fan-vaulted cloister, which survives from the pre-Reformation Royal Palace of Westminster. In the centre of that cloister, opening off the western walks, are a stacked pair of rooms, now known as the upper and lower oratories, whose original usage is now somewhat unclear. It is these spaces, which I'm going to stress may very well have been built as chantry chapels, but which don't today have any particularly strong surviving iconography reflecting any founder, that I want to explore today. I should apologise because they're now currently office space, so I don't have any interior pictures to show you. But their later history includes use as a waiting room, as a scullery, and as more recently offices for MPs and parliamentary staff. These rooms are a bit of an oddity because usually this type of room opening into the centre of a cloister would be a chapter house, as at the relatively nearby Old St Paul's. Indeed, if more usually for cloisters, you wouldn't expect to see anything in the centre of the cloister. But at Westminster, other considerations made this the best area, I think, to add potentially chapels to the existing institution of St Stephen's at Westminster, which was founded just about 676 years ago, as the official foundation date was the 6th of August, 1348. The oratory's history did not begin in a parliamentary space, but naturally, as in a religious context. The Commons Cloister, as it is now known, is not open to the public because it's very close to the Commons Chamber itself, but it was built for that Royal College of St Stephen, founded by Edward III, which occupied the adjoining double-storey chapel of the same name. You may be very familiar with St Stephen's Chapel because of the work of Maurice Hastings on St Stephen's place in the development of Perpendicular, and the PhD theses of Christopher Wilson and more recently James Hilson. It's worth noting here in this context that St Stephen's College, the institution, is a sister institution to St George's College at Windsor Castle, and the two institutions continue to have strong links through to the 16th century, when this new 16th century cloister and the two oratory spaces were built. If we look at the explosion of chantries in the 15th and 16th centuries, many chantry chapels were added inside or as expansions of existing churches. For example, at Windsor itself, the Bray Chantry Chapel was added to St George's in the early 16th century. At nearby Eton, Roger Lupton added his chantry chapel to the interior of Eton College Chapel, while across the road from St Stephen's at Westminster Abbey, Abbot Islip remodelled a chapel for his chantry there, using some of the same masons as are thought to have worked on the St Stephen's cloister, which I'm happy to talk further about masons and dating in questions. I've highlighted here deliberately chantry chapels that were built within the same institutional orbit as St Stephen's, and which were all, in their own ways, closely associated with English kingship. None of these chantry chapels were built in cloisters. What happened at St Stephen's to make this a space that we could potentially see chantry chapels in? I think we may be looking at a very, in part, a pattern due to a very restricted site plan and the pattern of donors to the to St Stephen's College. If we look at this ground plan of St Stephen's within the medieval palace, we could see that you could potentially add chapel spaces between the buttressing to the north and south of the chapel's walls. There was indeed a chapel there, which I've highlighted in blue, the Oratory of St Mary the Pew, which had chantry functions from the 14th century right through to the college's dissolution in 1548. The first known chantry added to St Mary the Pew was the temporary chantry of Edward III, founded in 1369 to pray for the souls of his wife Philippa and his mother Isabella, both of whom had recently died. Other later chantry requests made to the college asked for yearly remembrances to be kept at St Mary the Pew, or daily remembrances in some cases. So there was an established chantry foundation at St Stephen's that others added their prayers to. Theoretically, if patrons had wanted a building to go along with their endowment of priests, they could have added similar chapels to St Mary the Pew along that northern and southern walls of the main chapel. Yet no other chapel was constructed between the buttressing of the main chapel. Instead, we have these two oratory spaces built in the cloisters, orientated like the main chapel on an east-west axis. We know, additionally, thinking about the cloisters, that canons of the college asked to be buried there from the early 15th century onwards, and thus this area was very strongly connected with commemoration of the dead. If we're thinking about why once we've decided to put a building in the cloister area, why then in the centre of the cloister? Well, the other areas around the cloister are already built up and in use by the mid-14th century. To the north of the cloister next to the belfry is the Vicar's Hall and their kitchens, while the Vicar's houses run along the eastern range of the cloister. Obviously, to the south, you have St Stephen's itself, and to the west, Westminster Hall. So if you're going, by the mid-15th century, once you're going to put anything into that area, it has to be built into the centre. It's not particularly surprising because cloisters usually are used as an area to gather together the community's buildings. There's also a context here of the cloister's purpose liturgically. Cloisters are needed for processions and to join together the precinct. And the surviving 16th century cloister at St Stephen's is the third cloister known to have occupied the same site between St Stephen's Chapel, Westminster Hall, and that belfry at the top. Two earlier cloisters had been built or partially built at royal expense and are thus documented in the royal building accounts of the 14th century, which Tim Ayres has recently published in the Camden Society editions. The second cloister may not have been completed until the middle of the 15th century, an element that we're going to return to in a moment when thinking about how these oratory spaces relate to the earlier cloisters in their own history. The third, and fortunately well-surviving cloister, despite Second World War damage, while clearly 16th century in appearance, does not appear in the building accounts of Henry VIII. However, this is not evidence particularly either way whether or not these cloisters were a royal building project, as the accounts of the Office of Works under Henry VIII do not survive from before 1529. Fortunately, we have a fairly early description of the cloister, but not of the oratories. John Stowe, in his survey of London at the end of the 16th century, where he identifies the whole complex as being the project of John Chamber, the King's Doctor, and also the Dean of St Stephen's College from 1514 to its dissolution in 1548. Stowe describes it as a cloister of curious workmanship and gives us the astonishingly high price of 11,000 marks that he says Chamber spent on the project. As a side note here, the only indication we have of patronage in the surviving decorative scheme of the cloister is a heraldic boss here that shows the arms of Cardinal Wolsey as Cardinal Archbishop of York. Wolsey had been Dean of St Stephen's for 2 years, from 1512 to his elevation to the bishopric in 1514, and he retained close ties to the college after he was made Archbishop in the second half of 1514, and then a cardinal in 1515. This is a puzzle I've explored elsewhere, but the presence of this boss is relevant for us today because it suggests that the oratory spaces, along with the other elements of the cloister, need to be dated closer to 1515 to 1520 than the date of before 1529 given by the Royal Commission on Historic Monuments Volume for London. If we now come back to how the oratories relate to that history of building and rebuilding in the cloister area, what is their relationship to that second cloister begun under Richard II in the 1390s, and whether there's anything in that earlier history that might explain the construction circa 1510 of the oratories. The cathedrals make a very good comparison in general for trying to work out anything to do with St. Stephen's, because from the very beginning, they were expected to behave like a small version of a cathedral, particularly relating to liturgy. And of course, cloisters are in part liturgical spaces. Helpfully, in 1394, the college and its site were described in an agreement with Westminster Abbey next door. The new cloisters were in the process then of being constructed. The Latin uses the future subjunctive. But the most significant bit of information for our purposes today is that the chapter house of St. Stephen's was expected to be moved in that agreement. The chapter house, according to the agreement, was currently in a small chapel unnamed underneath the chapel of St. Mary the Pew, which you can see in blue on the slide, and it was going to be moved to sit within the cloister area. Where? We don't know, but remember the buildings around the cloister had already been built up by that point. So would it be expected to be built out into the centre of the cloisters as at Old St. Paul's? The chapter house of a secular college, just like at a larger secular cathedral, would need to have seating for the college's members. Fortunately for St. Stephen's, unlike the large chapter of a medieval cathedral of up to 50 people, the college's chapter was only about 13 people, and so you could probably fit them in to one of the oratory spaces relatively easily. For reference, I managed to get about 24 people to stand inside the lower oratory at the St. Stephen's Chapel Project Conference in 2016. So you can fit them in. Other clues also help us to build up a picture of what might be going on institutionally to build these two spaces in the 1510s, and to answer the question of how they might relate or indeed have been copied over from an earlier cloister. The building accounts from the 1390s, from that Ricardian effort of the 1390s, only really give details to 2 walks of a cloister, suggesting that royal funding paid for only half of the work at that time. What we don't know, because the college's own accounts don't survive, is whether they kept the earlier walks of the cloister built by Edward III in the 1350s, or whether the college's own members over the next decades put in their resources to continue, perhaps quite slowly, the work of rebuilding the cloister. The clue, a possible clue, although it's a bit of an ambiguous one, comes from the will in 1477 of this man, William Lyndwood, seen here in a sketch from the 1850s when they found his body, Bishop of St. David's and a royal administrator. Lyndwood wanted to be buried at St. Stephen's, and indeed, as you can see, was buried at St. Stephen's. And his reason was, to quote him, that he had received the gift of consecration as a bishop there 5 years previously to his death. He also asked for a perpetual chantry to be set up for his soul, which his executors chose to set up at St. Stephen's, as we know from the license to found it granted in 1454. In return for being allowed to be buried at St. Stephen's, William Lyndwood left, among other things, 600 marks to the college that he specified were to be used for the cloister and bell tower of the said chapel, suggesting that in the mid-15th century, there was work planned or ongoing on the cloister. If we jump forward a century in relation to William Lyndwood to the 1540s, when inventory of the college's possessions was taken at the dissolution in 1548, there is a reference to the contents of Lyndwood's chapel, presumably therefore his Chantry chapel. But we don't know of any building specifically constructed for Lyndwood's chapel. So are we possibly looking at the executors and the college making a decision to use those 600 marks in part to build a Chantry chapel for Lyndwood that was then rebuilt in the 16th century? Incidentally, the Lyndwood Chantry was still active in 1548 and was staffed by 2 perpetual chaplains. So they're still clearly using a space for his Chantry. So if we come back to that plan, the reference to Lyndwood's chapel suggests that circa 1510, 1515, when the new cloister was begun, the 14th century cloister that it replaced already potentially had a 15th century Chantry chapel attached to it, and possibly also the chapter house if that had been moved as expected in the 1394 agreement. The chapter house would be a more expected addition to this kind of space because of the well-known chapter house at Old St. Paul's. Unlike the 2-storey cloister that survives today within the Palace of Westminster, that 14th century cloister it replaced was single-storey. And if people have questions about that, I can talk about why exactly we know that difference. When the new 2-storey cloister was begun, therefore, the college seems to have used it to create that second chapel space, perhaps in addition to rebuilding the Lyndwood chapel. By turning to look at the architectural details that survive of the oratories, I want to think about whether we can see that in the architecture beyond the obvious comparison to what I've got on the screen now of the chapter house at Old St. Paul's. So this is the exterior of the chapels. Let's start with the upper oratory, because in many ways it's actually the more interesting space because it's got more unusual features. Although it too has seen heavy repairs over the centuries, and this exterior has been heavily modified by Charles Barry. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that eastern wall here, where it's there in the 19th century drawing, so it's not an invention of Charles Barry, but you have this raised area here. From the inside, it looks very much like the backing for a reredos, suggesting that there was originally an altar at the eastern end, as you would expect of a Chantry chapel. The other thing to notice that survives in the upper oratory is what I've given you an engraving of from Frederick Mackenzie, which are these niches which sit in the pillars here, all the way around the upper oratory, which might very well have held statues of some type and look very much like contemporary examples from the Henry VII chapel at Westminster Abbey, which may give us another clue to the dating and masons at work here and in the cloister as a whole. What is lacking in the upper oratory, however, is, although of course it may have been present and since been lost, is any indication of to whom this chapel space was dedicated and for whose commemoration it was used. If we use the model we see elsewhere at the St. Stephen's site, of a higher status chapel sitting above an undercroft, I would suggest that the upper oratory we might tentatively identify as Lyndwood's chapel. It would fit with the rest of the collegiate architecture because St. Mary the Pew and the main chapel of St. Stephen both sit on the first floor, with that unnamed chapel. There was originally the chapter house sitting underneath St. Mary the Pew, and the parliamentary chapel, which still exists today, of St. Mary Undercroft sitting beneath St. Stephen's. If we turn now to the lower oratory, the survival pattern here really is, in many ways, the inverse of what it is upstairs. The walls are entirely rebuilt, and had been rebuilt many times, so the pattern of windows cannot be trusted at all, and any evidence of a altar at the eastern end has long since been destroyed by that area being cut through to give access to kitchen buildings built in the centre of the cloister in the 18th century. And this was used as a scullery. So again, absolutely, completely cut through in every way possible. So the walls give us no clues as to what was going on. The ceiling, however, we've still got the 16th century vaulting. The paterae don't really seem, to my eyes, to give us much indication of any kind of patronage. There's no central boss, nothing that's particularly strongly heraldic. But if we go outside and look at the western walk of the cloister, so the bays immediately outside this oratory chapel, we get this pattern. Immediately outside the door of the lower oratory is the central boss. It has Christ the King, as you can see on the screen. To the north, the central boss of the next bay is St. Stephen, the protomartyr, and to the south of the central boss is the Virgin Mary and Child. And this is really striking iconography for St. Stephen's College, because these three are the central dedications of the college itself, which was founded to the honour of God, the Virgin Mary, and St. Stephen's. It's also worth noting here that the Virgin Mary both has the Christ Child with her and is crowned, because one of the strong associations from the very start with St. Stephen's College is with Mary as both Queen of Heaven and as a mother. Edward III's rather tart comment in the foundation letter pattern is that the dedication is to the Virgin Mary, who had been a better mother, with to him implied. So what we've got here is a very strong institutional association immediately outside that lower oratory. Are we then potentially looking at the college's chapter house, where its corporate life was agreed? Possibly, maybe, hard to know. Finally, and very briefly, because it relates again to usage of these spaces, I want to touch on reuse. Within a generation of these two oratories being built, St. Stephen's College was dissolved in 1548. The buildings around the cloister rapidly became housing for favoured MPs and then exchequer officials after 1572. There was a dispute in the 1590s into which the housing in the cloisters became tangled up in, and so in that year plans were drawn up, ground plans showing the cloisters as they were being used at that time. And both of what are today the oratories were identified as chapels on that plan, and those plans are now in the Cecil papers at Hatfield. Is this a remnant of a memory of their pre-1548 use as chantry chapels? Or is it that these are chapels still in use for the exchequer officials of Protestant England? We know, incidentally, possibly irrelevantly, that one of those cloister inhabitants in the 1590s, Vincent Skinner, had gone out of his way to build a new chapel in his country house. The oratories are fascinating and enigmatic spaces that have survived to this day within the Houses of Parliament, and I'm afraid they raise more questions than I have answers for them. I hope this exploration of their institutional and architectural context might give us some new and interesting questions to ask about what we're looking for when we see chantry chapels within this cloistral context on an extremely restricted site, and what's going on in relation to the college's chapter house. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. I've got so many questions. I'm gonna jump in first of all, actually, with my question. I was wondering what the advantage, is there a practical advantage to having a two-storey cloister as opposed to a one-storey cloister, or is it just showing off?
I think it's showing off, honestly. It's the only practical advantage that it gives is possibly somewhat incidental. In 1533, Henry VIII has a closet cut through from the upper walk of the cloister into the windows of Westminster Hall, so we can watch feasts from there. And I have wondered in the past if part of the reason, if the cloisters are being used as a more general access route, not just by the college, but by everybody, by inhabitants of the Palace of Westminster, whether they might want to separate out that traffic.
Oh, okay, yes, like a secular level and a canonical level.
Yeah, possibly, although the upper levels survived so badly that, you know, there's no particular evidence that you could use to even begin to answer that question. So yeah, it's hard to tell, but it does seem to get used for secular things.
Oh, very interesting. Let me just see. So if anyone else has a question, please feel free to make yourself known and unmute yourself in order to ask Elizabeth. I think everyone might still be digesting. The other question I had to ask was whether or not there was, what kind of drove the decision of canons and clerics, depending on where they wanted to be buried? Because I know they're sometimes in the church, they're sometimes in the cloister, Chantry house. Does this change chronologically over time? Does it depend on the individual person? Is this actually something you can look at all? I was just wondering what kind of the thought process behind the individual canon going, where do I want to be buried?
Some of it seems to be, a lot of it seems to be about friendship. There's two early 16th century canons who say they want to be buried by each other in the cloister. So they do seem to sort of acknowledge either earlier burials or potential burials, because at the time when the wills are written, I think they're both still alive. But in any case, they've sort of made a plan. For a lot of the men who work at St. Stephen's and who then ask to be buried there, it really has been their working home. So they're being buried in a site that they know well and they have very strong ongoing ties to. It's also in terms of commemoration, the college is set up for commemoration. So you're essentially adding yourself to an ongoing guaranteed set of commemoration of your soul without having to found and pay for and maintain, you know, an entire separate chapel. You can pay for the canons to say masses for you once a year. And, you know, that costs a lot less than paying Chantry chaplains, as Lyndwood's executors are, for another century.
It's like perks of the job.
Essentially, yes, I think it might be a part of that.
Where are the earliest ones buried at Westminster? Where do they start?
The reason we know they may start earlier than the early 15th century, but the Abbot book, which records things like where people are buried or where they asked to be buried, only starts in the early 15th century. One early canon asked to be buried at Westminster Abbey. Another one may be buried in Surrey. They've been doing some archaeology there, and I had an email from Nigel Saul asking, did it make sense that this person, they might have found this person's tombstone, which was very exciting. So it seems there may be interested in being buried there in the 14th century. We've just completely lost the records, and the centre of the cloister has had so much building work done to it that you're not going to find any physical evidence of burials at this point. I keep on hoping that they'll dig it up and, you know, we can see if there's any actual surviving burials. But given the 18th century scullery and kitchens, there's probably
don't know what happened to the later phases then, to the bones is gone.
Presumably, yeah.
It's completely removed.
So we just know the names.
Just the names of them.
Yeah.
I was interested that the bosses had survived, but because you were saying around the outside of the Chantry, there are little plinths for the statues to stand on, which have obviously been removed. So I'm just surprised.
No, they're interior. I can show you the interior.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that's a purely case of what I have photos of, what I can, you know, what I can use basically. But yeah, the niches are still there interiorly. One of the office inhabitants used to put mementos in there.
But there's no statues there anymore.
No.
Because that's what I was wondering. Because the fact the statue's been removed, but they've kept the bosses with still religious imagery on them.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. Integral to the structure. The one, that's kind of hard to cut them out. I suppose you could cut them back, but no one seems to have particularly wanted to do that. They seem to have just lived with it. Hard to know what's going on there. But yes, the bosses survive. The walls are hopelessly cut up. They seem to have kept some idea of where the reredos might have been, but why, I don't know.
It does seem a little bit of a labour of love trying to work out what on earth has happened to this building, especially seeing as you can't actually access the building because it's parliamentary.
Well, you can, but you sort of have to, recess is usually the way to go. I see David Harrison's on here. He spent a lot more time in there than I have. So, no. But yes, you can just about access it. If you, I was going to do a stone survey, try and do a bit of a survey this summer, but obviously that's not happening. So
maybe next summer.
Maybe next summer, hopefully.
Does anyone else want to have a question? Lizzie, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah, just it might be a bit of a naive question. Thanks, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. I was just wondering if we know sort of the total number of chantries that were founded in St. Stephen's by the Reformation. It's just because I know in Scotland, in sort of comparable institutions, they really pack them in. Sometimes you have like, up to 40 or even maybe perhaps a few more separate chantries within a collegiate church. And it seems always, I don't think there's enough space for them, but they seem to have shared altars and done all sorts of things. And I wondered whether that was the case at St. Stephen's too.
I'm trying to get a rough number. I think it's about 15. Some are temporary, some are permanent, and I'm quite sure that there's more temporary chantries that have disappeared entirely by the time of the Reformation, either because they've not been kept up because they've expired, as it were. So you're looking at, yes, quite a lot. And at St. Stephen's, where people identify where they want chantries to go, they say St. Mary the Pew, always. So I don't know how they managed to, layer them into what's quite a small chapel space, but that's where they seem to want them, is that oratory space. And then there's about, not quite chantries, but sort of on a sliding scale from chantries, there's about, I'd say, 60 odd orbits that the main college is supposed to observe. So you're looking at a couple of orbits a week at least. So it's kind of very much layered upon layering of chantries, commemoration, potential future commemoration.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks. That's really interesting.
Elizabeth, I just wonder if you could expand upon, so during your paper you talked about how it had been a single cloister, and it's changed as double cloister, and I was just wondering if you could expand upon what you were hinting at but didn't quite get into.
Yeah, it's twofold. If I go back to sharing my screen, and then go back to the plans, it's these. It's the buttressing here. That's the buttressing for Westminster Hall, which matches the buttressing on the western side of Westminster Hall. There's a picture from just after, that buttressing is no longer there, that's been taken out, but there's a picture post-fire in 1834 of the way the buttressing cuts really awkwardly through the timbers of the upper cloister. So it's been, the upper cloister has been built around the buttressing. So that already says that there's some really awkward interaction going on there. But the other reason is that a two-story cloister built up against Westminster Hall would mean that you didn't need the buttressing there in the first place.
Okay.
Because you get enough support from the stone of the cloister up against the hall. So between the awkward intersection of the buttressing with the 16th century cloister, and that you would do quite a lot of negotiating to put the buttressing in the first place suggests that the Ricardian cloister is single story, and thus when they come to rebuild in the 1510s, they decide, for whatever reason, to build upwards.
Lots of money coming in.
Yeah.
Got to spend it on something.
Yeah, well, huge amounts of money. I still don't know what they spent it all on. 11,000 marks. You could build an entire new monastery in the 16th century for that sum.
So you just have the lump sum, you've got no itemization at all?
Yeah. It's John Stowe in his account for the 1590s. So we don't even know where he's getting that number from.
Oh, okay.
He could have gotten it entirely wrong. We don't know. It could be there's a plaque in the cloisters at that time, and he's seen it, and it says, "This is how much we spent on it." We just don't know. So yes, I will stop sharing, and then I can see if other people want to ask questions or comments or things they think I should have taken into account that I haven't.
I know. I think you've given us an excellent paper to chew on. I think everybody else has asked their questions. Oh, John's got one. Could you unmute yourself, John, please?
Oh, hang on.
Yes.
This is probably, thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. That was terrific. And I also have a rather naive question. I'd always assumed that the reason there was a two-storey cloister was because the chapel itself was two-storey. So, does the upper level of the cloister correspond, roughly speaking, with the upper level of the chapel? Do you actually need some sort of substructure if the canons are going to be able to enter the upper chapel from the upper story of the cloister?
It's not a naive question at all, because I've spent quite a lot of time trying to work that out. In the current Palace of Westminster, it's about a 6-foot drop from the level of St Stephen's Hall, which is at the same level as St Stephen's Chapel was, to the cloister. But there's a bigger problem because that's also where the Richard II porch was. So it's not clear if and when the upper cloister was cut through to the porch. By the late 17th century, it has been, because there are committee rooms that have been built in the space between the cloister and the chapel. So there's cut through at some point. The evidence just isn't there to say if there's a cut through when the new cloister is built. I'd like there to be, because it would make, as you say, it would make sense for the canons to be able to go up to that upper level and straight into the west end of the chapel. But it's really hard to know, and we don't have any. Because of the way the vicars' houses are converted into lodging ranges in the 16th century, 50 years before those plans, we just don't have a good sense of where the staircases were around the cloisters. There's some very odd things in that 1590s plan, which may be the remnant of earlier, access points, but it's, by that point, we're up to about 10 inhabitants at least between those two dates, and lots of chopping and changing. So it would make sense, and the drop would be about what you could put a couple of steps in and be absolutely fine. But blame the House of Commons for the willingness to do massive building works and not record them, for an inability to really properly answer that question.
Well, I think it's still yeah. Actually, for lack of recording. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask or would like clarified, or?
No, I think we just need to thank you once more, Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.